Just a quick reminder that each episode could contain some spoilers, so watch with discretion. Sit back and enjoy the show. Well, welcome to another one of our episodes of The Gamer's Advocate, where we discuss various topics that are related to gaming. And as we've always said before, you get 1,000 gamers in a room and you'll probably get 1,000 different opinions. But we do like to go over some things that are interesting to us. And today's topic will be graphics. How important are graphics to gaming? You know, with the trend of pixelated games coming back, especially from indie developers, it seems like the most important thing has always been and always will be, how does the game play? And there are various games that I consider to be some of my favorite of all time, but I wouldn't say that necessarily the graphics were the reason. But there are other several games that I could say, in hindsight, I really don't see this game being done in any other form or format, because if it were to be remastered per se, then I couldn't say that I would probably have the same affinity towards it. But anyway, let's open it up. Do you have any examples you can think of?
Get into a little known series of Final Fantasy.
Who'd have thought?
So my favorite game of all time, Final Fantasy Tactics, is kind of an interesting example in terms of graphics, because I feel like Final Fantasy Tactics is a decision about art style as opposed to working within graphical limitations. And obviously, in 1997, there were graphical limitations, but I don't think that is the major reason that Tactics looks the way it does. And I've always appreciated the kind of sprite art style that they chose to go with in Tactics. I don't think it's gotten in the way of the storytelling. I don't think it tremendously impacted the gameplay. I think it's an artistic choice, and that works. There are games where I would say graphics are far more important. I think if you look at popular modern games, things like Gran Turismo and a lot of like racing games, graphics are hugely important because people love looking at those vehicles. They love the style of them. And if you can capture the reality of what those vehicles look like, people are going to appreciate that. So I think it's kind of a decision based on what is important to your game. And if your game is story focus on the story. The graphics don't have to be top tier for a game to be a good game, but the graphics will make an impact if they are an integral part of the game you're designing.
Well, staying with that Final Fantasy thought, I mean, it's gone through so many different types of graphical designs for each series, each game, I should say, because within a game, it seems like it could be its own series post that game or whatever. And so, I mean, could you imagine, say, the original Final Fantasy being remastered completely as a Final Fantasy 1 and still having the same impact? Or do you think the game structure or the gameplay alone is enough?
So I think overwhelmingly the very early Final Fantasy games, they've had their pixel remaster, so they've been kind of updated to be improved slightly. But they maintain that original art style. And I think that style is consistent with the other elements of the game. So it fits. I've kind of mentioned before, like Final Fantasy 1, Final Fantasy 2 are very kind of simple, generic adventure games. You choose your class. You can be just kind of any adventurer you want to be. And there's a kind of simplistic progression through various story elements. And I think if you were to update that gameplay to modern graphics, there would be such a stark contrast between the modern graphics and the retro gameplay. I think there's a lot of elements of the original Final Fantasy games that have been dramatically improved in more recent games. There's elements of conveyance that just don't exist in Final Fantasy 1, where if you miss something in a conversation with somebody, you have no idea what to do next. And I think if you were to play that in a game that had modern graphics, it would be far more upsetting, because it feels like they should have realized what was wrong if, they've progressed to the point where the graphics are so much more impressive they should also recognize the other elements of game design that needed to progress. So I think graphics can, in a way, negatively impact your game if you focus on them too heavily and you ignore the other elements of gameplay that need to be addressed for a game to be good. That being said, I love the decision with Final Fantasy VIII to move to kind of more realistic graphics of the characters. I think that was a very bold decision. I think they did very well, but you can still see the limitations of the technology. And it's made for one of the funnier memes that I've seen, in that Rhinoa addressing Squall and saying, "You're one of the most attractive men here." And then you can zoom in on his face and it's very pixelated. It just makes for enjoyment.
Hilarious.
Well, I did have, oddly enough, in my back pocket, my sort of opening response to a question like this: are graphics important to a game? My go-to thought on this has always been maybe, which I accept is incredibly non-committal.
That's a bold stance.
Yeah, hold on.
Hot take, calm.
Hot take time.
Will good graphics ever hurt your game? And my initial thought was no, except in this odd situation that Banana has just described, where you might have a game where it is so incredibly incompetent in all of its other areas that you almost find yourself insulted by how good the graphics eventually end up being. If the graphics are incredible, but the music's awful, the gameplay is awful, it's 25 minutes long, nothing happens, and 10 minutes of that is the credits, you're going to be irritated by how much time they spent on those graphics. So I guess in that very narrow circumstance, good graphics might hurt your game. But I can't really, in any real scenario, imagine a point where better graphics are going to hurt your game. And depending upon the style of game, very much it can be of great importance. And the two that styles of game that I really think that they're so important for, one is quite specific, an example. But the idea is, if you want to be put into a living, breathing world, if you want to make me feel that I'm being transported through time, into our world, into the past, into the future, whatever it might be, you've got to fucking sell that to me. And I find it very hard to believe that Red Dead Redemption 2 is going to have that same immersive quality it did if we put it on 10 years older hardware. I think it really, really benefits from how beautiful it looks. That is a game you can really sink yourself into and actually be there.
It's very gritty.
Yeah. And that's something that pulls you in.
Yeah.
And the second one, which Banana pretty much went towards, but if we can go one step further, he talked about things like racing games. I think you mentioned Gran Turismo. Simulators, full stop. Whether it be agriculture simulator, whether it be truck simulator, whether it be flight simulator, I think those actively suffer from worse graphics. And the better graphics will genuinely improve the game. Because like Banana said, people want to look at that vehicle. They want to look out of the plane windows and see the ground below them. They want to have the feeling of stepping into a cab in one of these trucks. So in those situations, I think it's a quite distinct yes, graphics are important to the game. More often than not, the answer is a really soft maybe. Maybe they will, maybe they won't.
Yeah, I think there's definitely examples in both directions. I think to your point that sometimes graphics may hurt your game if you neglect everything else. I don't know if that's so much graphics hurting your game as much as it is serving to highlight the other failures you've had. So if you build your game and the story sucks, the gameplay sucks, the music sucks, your graphics aren't actually making it worse. It's just you've proven you can do something well, and then you did a terrible job in every other regard. The graphics aren't hurting your game. It's just I'm much more abundantly aware of the other areas that need work because I can see what a great job you did with the graphics. And I agree with simulators. I think, I mean, there are ones that I think kind of stand out from that rule. Like if you go back and look at House Flipper, I loved that game. It's not the most realistic. It doesn't have the greatest graphics. A lot of things are oversimplified because they kind of need to be. But it's a wonderful game, and it's very relaxing. It's very engaging. It's calming, It has a pleasant soundtrack to it. Like, there's a lot to love about that game. And I don't know that the graphics really make a tremendous difference in either direction, because they're very much not the focal point of the game. Meanwhile, there are other games that have what I would say are kind of incredible graphics that I truly don't care about. Things like the Quarry, and games in that regard. A big part of that is just it doesn't suit me. That genre of game doesn't appeal to me. But I'm personally not a huge fan of taking the voice actor or an actor or anybody who exists in the real world and digitalizing them to put them in a game. I think it's lazy. I think it's impressive how well you can do it, but I don't care. I think you could have created a whole new character. I don't need you to make a movie out of a video game. I need you to make a video game. And I think if you focus on representing the actors, just make a movie.
Yeah. Yeah, but if you have a really good actor and they're actually able to act the scene, I think that's where why they did what they did in some of those games. Because yes, you can basically take their body mechanics and stuff, but maybe you don't want to use their representation, or maybe they have a legal reason not to want to use, hey, don't use my face for this. I don't want to be associated with this. I don't want to use my voice. I'll act for it. There may be a plethora of other reasons, but if you have an amazing actor, I mean, I don't know, if you get William Dafoe to act for you and he can be in your game, I mean, I might want to use him, to be honest. But I know what you're saying with that. But as far as like the simulated games you were saying, like House Flipper is an interesting one that you mentioned, because on a very similar game, Power Wash, I think I started thinking, I was like, well, can you make House Flipper into a pixelated game? And it's still and you could actually. I could still see it as a pixelated because you're still just renovating things, right? You're just doing that. But Power Wash, I don't think you could. I think you definitely have to see the dirt.
You're absolutely right.
So there's a certain element of there. It's like, yeah, the gameplay is actually bettered by the style of graphics that's incorporated into that type of game. And
I just really want to highlight the fact that you're talking about a game that has a Final Fantasy VII DLC. So now it's not Com and I bringing up Final Fantasy VII.
Legion's always talking about Final Fantasy.
All the time.
Coming full circle. Here we go again.
Yeah. And then as far as like, certain asset games, like racing games and stuff, I mean, I know Com loves his vehicles, and I think Com is the only one I've ever seen Parallel Park.
This is Cyberpunk, isn't it?
Yeah. Parallel Park. What was it? I don't know, Ford Fiesta or something? He loved that little car. He was out there driving that thing, going the speed limit, parallel parking.
I'm trying to stop a red light, but the game doesn't have red lights.
Yeah. So I swear, it's one of those things that I think graphics for like a game like that work great for most people, but especially if you're watching a streamer like Com, who really takes the immersion to that next level. Because if that was in a pixelated game, I don't know, it just wouldn't hit the same way.
I think I wouldn't have had the urge.
Yeah.
The reason I wanted to drive correctly in Cyberpunk, the reason why I wanted to live as much as I could like Arthur in Red Dead Redemption 2 and not use fast travel and try and make as much use of the world as I could, was because of how beautiful the world was. And I feel that alters the way you play the game somewhat. There are times when if a game, and I will never get this with a pixel game, I'll never get this with an old PS1 title, it won't pull me into the point that I forget I'm playing a game almost.
Mm-hmm.
Sharp turn there. I think that's doable. I feel like my dad. Oh. Yeah, this is fine. This is fine. This is fine. Yeah. Perfect. Perfect. Just need you to get out of the car and just wave me in. Yeah, that'll be fine, Com. Yeah.
But if your graphics are on point, you can get me pretty close to that spot. And that's what would happen with Cyberpunk. That's what would happen with Red Dead Redemption 2. But that is not what would happen with Final Fantasy VII. As much as I love that game, it's never going to get me quite there, because its graphics will always have something that you look at and think, oh, that looks a bit crap. Or, oh, that looks great. They did a lot with what they had. I will never look at the backdrops in Final Fantasy VII, as beautiful as they are. Those hand-drawn backdrops, beautiful. You'll never pull me in because I'm always thinking that's just a backdrop. I can't interact with that book on the shelf. I can't even get close to that book on the shelf. I can't look at it from another angle. And that's one of those things that I think just, graphics can really give you, is that ability to be genuinely immersed in a game. Now, it won't be the same for everyone, but for me, that's a pretty exclusive thing. You've got to look graphically very strong for me to be truly immersed.
Yeah, because we've talked before about The Witcher 3, because you weren't really too interested until you started thinking, like, what if I start playing this? Like, what would Geralt do type thing? And when you start playing as The Witcher, a lot of things start making more sense why the game is designed the way it is. So this isn't really a game design discussion, but graphic-wise, I know the game well enough, good or bad. I don't know if this is a comment of how many hours I've put into The Witcher 3, but I mean, I can play it without a UI and go to town. I don't have to fast travel. I know where things are. I mean, I know all my hotkeys, so I can do all my spells. I can put on my blade oils or whatever, all without a UI. So it's one of those that you can really get immersed in. And I couldn't say that I could do any of that in a pixel game, because you need those menus, you need those drop downs, you need to see what is, because you can't just like on the fly do that. So that's the big difference between those two.
I think you've also highlighted an element of where you can go with a game based on its graphics. So that you've talked about like being immersed in the game when the graphics are good enough that you can feel that connection. And I think we've seen a lot of players for very popular games kind of ignore what the intent of the game was and create their own version. So you have things like GTA roleplay servers where people play Grand Theft Auto as if they lived in that world, and they'll do things like work in a fast food restaurant in a video game. I don't want to work in a fast food restaurant in real life. I certainly don't want to role play as somebody who works in one, but people do it because the graphics are good enough that they can be immersed in that and create a character that feels real. And I don't think that's an option in games with much more limited or much less developed graphics.
Baldur's Gate series. Those sprites that you have in 1 and 2 are actually 3D models that they put into a sprite form, so that way they could actually be used in that software. And all the backgrounds that are there are actually handmade. And so that what they did is that they, of course, opened the pathways. And that's why sometimes characters struggle to go through doors and things, because they only have so much space there. But they're trying to show it as a real space there. So even though you could traverse all the entire hotel or the Candlekeep Inn or whatever, you can only go out through one door and instead of the entire wall panel there. It's the southern part of that scene, but you can only go out through that one area. So my point here is that Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't do any of that, obviously. It's much more graphically intense. And I would argue that, and I've made this point before in some of my videos, that there's something to be said about the mind's eye. And when you have a game like the original Baldur's Gate, where you're at Candlekeep Inn or the library, you can vision, even though they're setting a background there for you that's really the same assets, it's the same bookcases and everything else, your mind is still putting together a vision of the story that really the graphics can never do. So even though you have Baldur's Gate 3 that has a lot of those great features, like the Elfsong Tavern, the way they did that was just amazing. I love that tavern in that game. But in the original one, I was able to kind of do that myself. And so it's never going to meet the quality that you envision for your imagination. But I'm not going to say anything bad necessarily about the graphics of Baldur's Gate 3. I will say, though, that every time that you have a graphically intense game, no matter, even if you put all the time, resources, and you're a good storyteller and the game is done really well, you're opening yourself up to technical issues. So then you have a bunch of people who are going to like, it doesn't run on my system. Or every time I turn left with this companion, they do this. So you're going to have those graphical issues anytime you start escalating the amount of graphical features that you have, which, of course, we had back in the day too. But I'm just saying is that you take the good with the bad. But even if you make a perfect game, you're going to open yourself up to some issues with the graphics. So
I think that applies to almost every aspect of video gaming. Everything has become, and this is for the better and the worse, generally for the better, become so much more complicated than it would have been a long time ago. If you think of music, I mean, ultimately, when we're recording tracks for old RPGs, we're recording 2 to 4 to maybe 8 tracks of instruments. That's it. We're just sitting there one at a time, plinking them in on our little MIDI keyboard, job done. Now, if we're doing a AAA game and we're going to have an orchestra, we're probably going to get an orchestra. And now all of a sudden we've got 48 musicians in a room. That's 48 musicians who can play their part wrong. That's 48 musicians who might be slightly out of tune. You've got all these potential glitches and bugs that come in because it's become inherently more complicated over time. The programming, definitely infinitely more difficult than it used to be. Yeah, we have the advantages of things like Unreal Engine that we can work with, Unity we can work with, Frostbite we can work with, whatever it might be. But just everything has become so much exponentially bigger. That you've got a million. If you once had 1,000 places where you could have a problem, you've now got 1,000,000 places. In a few years' time, you'll probably have 1,000,000,000 places we can have those problems. It's just that trade-off that we have for the advancements that we've made.
I think you're getting to a point that I would really like to highlight, and that is, I think that the biggest element of graphics changing the way a game works is when we hit the technological threshold to upgrade from 2-dimensional games to 3-dimensional games.
Yeah.
And you'll see it in games like Zelda. 2-dimensional Zeldas are awesome. Every one of them works. 3-dimensional Zeldas, not so much. And it's because you now have game mechanics that don't work in 3 dimensions. So if you walk into a room in Zelda, in a 2D Zelda, and you have a bow and there are eyeballs on the walls, you think, oh, I'll shoot the eyeballs and I'll open a door somewhere. If you do that in a 3D Zelda, it turns into a more tedious aspect of, I have to rotate my camera around to cover 360 degrees horizontal and then 360 degrees vertical to try and spot all of these eyeballs that in a 2D Zelda are just directly in front of you at all times. That it represents at its core just a graphical upgrade, but it changes the way mechanics need to work because you are no longer functioning in the same world. Your world has been upgraded to be more complex. Your mechanics need to be upgraded to match that complexity in a way that is usable by your player. I need to stay away from Zelda because I'm gonna share a bunch of unpopular opinions on 3D Zeldas, and nobody's gonna want to care what we have to say anymore.
My favorite kind of opinion.
Well, well, Metroid was going down that path too. I mean, Metroid, the first couple of games, stellar, amazing, definitely top 5 in my opinion of all time. But then Metroid Prime came around, and that's 3D, and it's great. Metroid Dread has been great. Everything in between, yeah. But it was definitely going that same direction where you could say it's like very similar to the Zelda. You want to do this, you want to do that, but really it just doesn't work because you get a different philosophy now about how that world is supposed to be designed, and it kind of gets in the way of storytelling because even though Metroid's main thing wasn't really the story, it was about, just getting through the game. It's kind of developed that lore, that gameplay aspect of it. And so when you start incorporating the 3D stuff, they started doing some kind of methods of telling that story by still using a side scroller, but not doing it the same way they did it before, where it was more immersive. They just did it just to do it, So, but no, Prime is great. Dread is great. Fusion, I mean, it's good. It's really good. Everything else I couldn't really say is spectacular, but those are examples of the more 3D games similar to that Zelda. Mm-hmm.
It's something of a quirk that I found with the more advanced we get with games, something that I feel is it's not a step backwards, but it's something I personally haven't learned to juggle really correctly. Is if you think, and let's go for a simple top-down 2D game. Imagine that in the corner of this room in your top-down 2D game, there's a computer desk. You're going to have a little tiny line for the chair. Above that, there's the desk. You see the top of the computer staring up at you. And to the right of that, there's an empty spot on the desk. It takes up 2 squares. And that's it. But look at your own desk. So on my desk right now, I've got my computer here. I've got my secondary screen there. There's a bottle of water here. There's the glass of water, which shouldn't still be there, but it is there. There's my phone. There's 2 books there. There's my tablet thing for writing on a screen. That's there. There's another book there. That's the sound driver thing. That's there. Well, if you go back to that 2D game, you just have the computer. And you can probably interact with it. And you're going to get a small pop-up message saying, it's my home computer. Something like that. Render this now in that modern game. Render my desk. I don't actually know what I can interact with. If anything. Am I supposed to interact with the computer? What about the screen? Can I pick up the books? Probably not. Can I interact with that one book but not the others? Well, if I can interact with it, you're probably going to have to make it fucking glow or something so I know that I can interact with it. And all of a sudden, you're supping my immersion out ever so slightly because of this overabundance of detail that you don't actually need. And you'll see that, not to bring it up, but Final Fantasy, if it's painted on the backdrop, you probably can't interact with it.
Right.
But if it's then inserted above it as a 3D object, you probably can. And I find that for me, that's a problem I have sometimes with modern games, is I don't know what I can interact with. Or there will be things that I think, if I can interact with A, why can't I interact with B? And that inconsistency is there sometimes.
Well, you're describing what's happening a lot now in games where common assets are being used for indie developers, not always for that end up in a good game, right? They're just basically asset collections. Sometimes it's a good game. You take a game like Only Up, right? Only Up is one of those where they just take assets from all different games, just a ton of them, and your journey is. And so it's been a technical challenge to just make it to the end of the game. But what a lot of game developers are doing is that, especially horror, they're taking those same assets, making a game, throwing assets all over the place. You could be like an abandoned house or whatever, and you have a overturned chair here, you have a couch over there, you have a fireplace over there. None of it is interactable. None of it. And then you're supposed to find the one thing that you're supposed to find without any clues whatsoever, and then manage through. But there's so many games like that, and I forget exactly what the term is. It's not like it's called like an asset junk dump game or something. I forget what the common term is, but basically it's just, that's why you'll see the same type of games over and over. And I wouldn't say it's always for a quick buck, because I don't know every single game that's out there, but there's so many of them that are so similar. The problem is that how are you going to know that this developer is going to put out the 5 decent games or really 5 crap games just to make them,
Right.
I think we've all kind of hinted at the same point here, which is that graphics inherently aren't important as a game design element as much as consistency with the complexity of other elements of the game. So if your graphics are incredible and the rest of your game is simple, it's going to feel a little odd. But if your graphics get more complex as your game mechanics, your game design elements get more complex, you're going to feel more at home in a game. And there are elements of that where you might have to overhaul game mechanics as you upgrade graphics because the mechanic doesn't make sense in a more detailed environment. And I think Zelda, again, does a very good job of that in the 2D games, of recognizing mechanics that work in 2D. And then with the modern Zelda games, meaning the most recent ones, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, I think they kind of figured out, finally, how do we take that core Zelda gameplay that I've learned a new ability, I've picked up a new item, I need to use that to solve a puzzle now. I think it's not until Breath of the Wild that they really figured out how to modernize those puzzles to match the 3D graphical environment that they now have access to. And I think that is at its core the focus of the game design philosophy is, if you're going to dramatically improve one element of your game over everything else, it's going to stand out, and it might not stand out in a good way. But if you bring everything up at relatively similar levels, you're going to be able to appreciate all of those things together and not have one of them kind of awkwardly sticking out.
Yeah, you need that convergence sort of between graphics and gameplay and everything else in between, that everything matches up to some degree. You might have one thing that you're particularly good at and that happens to stand out in a positive sense. You need to make sure that one doesn't get too far ahead of the others to the neglect or negligence of the others.
Exactly. It's like you were saying earlier, when you have one thing that's exceptional, it almost serves to highlight the lack of exceptional features in other elements.
Yeah. Why the f*** is your music so good? But this game is dire.
Yeah.
Just make an album. Yeah. But I was thinking of games where this wouldn't be graphics directly, but it's a relationship between graphics, gameplay, and what your hardware can produce. I'm currently playing, for the first time actually, the remake of Resident Evil 1. And now this is, as I understand, because I played Resident Evil 1, the original, when I was a small kid, but then I went years without playing it. And now it's probably been 25 years since I played it. So I've got some very, very loose recollections of it. And I'm seeing, when playing the remake, the things that are pretty much the same. So we've got the layout of the mansion pretty much the same, a lot of the same camera angles. They just dress things up a bit more nicely. If there's a table with a paper on it, now it's got 50 papers and some of them are strewn across the place. Some have got blood on them. That kind of thing. It looks a lot better. But I love the limitation that they stuck with of those fixed cameras.
Resident Evil is a perfect example of embracing a limitation, to say that we can save a lot of memory, a lot of processing power, if we force the players to rely on this fixed camera angle. And it also works very well with the theme of the game because it heightens the suspense. You have this limited camera angle, you can only see events play out from that angle, and you need to piece together what's happening and figure out your course of action based on that limited data, and it makes the events much more suspenseful. And I think that's one of those elements where you can take a limitation and turn it to your benefit, and Resident Evil does an excellent job with that.
I would love to see someone today, maybe it exists, I'd love to see someone revisit that. I'd love to see people establishing some horror games with fixed camera angles. It's interesting, and you get to see genuine cinematography in a game. Actual creation of real shots.
Yeah.
And how that's going to affect how the player approaches this, how that's going to affect the placement of enemies, which you can't really do when you've got your player with their 360 rotatable camera for peeking around corners. You can limit what they can do with that. But I think not quite to the same extent. And I would love to see that developed on, hopefully by some indie developer somewhere who's currently working on that project.
Well, I wasn't always into Resident Evil. I always called Resident Evil kind of spooky mist. As I always refer, is a puzzle game that's spooky. So, but I came from the world of Silent Hill. And Silent Hill is right in that same vein, where it was limited. They could only do so much, but you add mist, you add fog, you kind of, and that only adds to the spookiness of it. And so the environment itself, they use that limited amount of software space and all, the assets at the time to kind of help enhance what they were doing. They actually did some pretty ingenious things, like that you can have a reflection in Silent Hill. And I can't remember what exactly they did, but they took the same assets and they mirrored it, but they hid it behind an invisible wall there. So when you're looking at yourself in the reflection, it's like you're only seeing the one. They did some really ingenious stuff with Silent Hill.
I think I remembered somebody digging into that and going into like how it was implemented. And it's exactly like you're saying. It's not a mirror so much as a window, and on the other side of the window is an exact copy of everything that you see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because even nowadays, reflections and take a lot of resources for games. So you don't. That's why you don't see them very often. That's why you need to play like a what's it? The house renovator stuff. You won't see your reflection. It's why. Why would you need to? Yeah. But yeah, no, I love Silent Hill, and everything about Silent Hill I've got. Oof. And so I'm a little concerned about the remake or the remaster. I think it's a remaster. No, it's a remake, I think, of Silent Hill 2.
No, a few years ago, it was a remake, a reboot, sorry, but that got cancelled, didn't it?
Yeah. But Silent Hill 2 is coming out, I believe, this year. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm going to play it either way. But
yeah. Well, if we look at how well received the Resident Evil 2, 3 mostly as well, and 4 remakes have been received, maybe that's a good sign for it.
Yeah. And as far as like the whole like environmental graphical stuff, I recently did Riven. I did that on my YouTube, and I'll tell you what, that is an amazing game. I loved Riven when it came out originally. I played that right away because I was a big Myst fan. And way back when Myst first came out, it was on a CD-ROM, but you got to remember there wasn't like a lot of games at all, if any, that were on CD-ROM. Everything was on a floppy. So for you to get a computer with this software in it, a lot of times the CD that came with it, with the computer, were screensavers. And so a lot of people thought it wasn't a game. It was just a screensaver. Like you can walk through it and they didn't really think it was a game so much.
Not a glowing review, is it?
Yeah, well, they just didn't think what it was. And it was just like, oh, okay, you just blowed it in there. What is this? It's a game? And it's not like anything in Myst was obvious either. It didn't tell you anything. You just went around frame to frame, and so you discover things. And the unfortunate part about Myst back then and Riven is that even if you kind of knew what to do, you had to wait for the CD to spin so you could draw the scene, so you could go here. And then if you're like, oh, I need to go back and get this, and then you got to go back and get it. But now with the new Riven that came out and Myst about 2 years ago, beautiful, just absolutely beautiful. You're able to kind of get in there and play the game kind of almost the way it was probably intended. The puzzles are still just as intricate and tricky, but you're able to kind of move in there, and so you become actually more immersed than you did in, say, like in comparison to something like the lock camera frame. You're not locked at all. You're able to look around, look up, right, left, and hear the beach and see where the sounds are coming from. Oh, it's just amazing. But then that goes into like a game series that I know Banana's very familiar with, but it's the oh my goodness, it just left the top of my head. It's those
We're not gonna guess.
The one we said you sound like.
Monkey Island.
Monkey Island, that's it.
What? Apparently, Legion thinks that I sound like Guybrush Threepwood.
That's so good.
It's because you do. No, but
I try not to listen to myself, so I can't weigh in on whether or not I do.
But that cartoon art style, it was pretty unique for its time, and I like how they've always embraced it. Mm-hmm. You know, I couldn't see it any other way. So
I think you've kind of highlighted an element there that I think definitely plays into the conversation at hand, which is the mood of your game and the graphical style are directly linked. So in horror games in particular, it's not so much about the graphics quality of what you see, because horror at its core is more about what you don't see. And you'll see it in any media, video games, television, movies. There's the suspense building of knowing that something is out there, and not knowing what it is terrifying. So for horror games, I would say graphics are not so important as much as setting the mood with suspense and making sure that you convey that element of terror without the graphics, with just absence. Whereas in games like Monkey Island, where, it's a point and click, you need to see everything.
Yeah.
You have a lot more freedom to embrace an art style and play with the graphics because what you're representing is important and it's integral to the gameplay. Really, all it has to do is be recognizable for what it is, and then beyond that, you're free to do whatever you want with it. Whereas in horror, if it's not recognizable, it might be better.
I think there's another thing with horror as well, which is if we get very advanced in our graphics. I'm thinking of, there was a horror game released a few years ago. It's quite notorious. PT made its appearance briefly on the PlayStation before getting pulled away. Ended as a trailer, I think, for Silent Hills, if I remember correctly.
I think that's right.
The graphics on that, for me, was so good that I didn't want to play it. It's so unsettling to play a horror game that is that well done. I almost need it to not quite be realistic. I need it to be a little bit uncanny. I need it to look a bit off, because otherwise I'm going to be ill at ease the entire time. I'm going to feel gross. I'm going to feel uncomfortable, and not in the way that the developer wants me to feel. I'm just going to want to turn the damn game off. And that's going to be me just being a bit of a coward. But I wonder how common that feeling would be of this horror is a bit too real for my tastes.
Dead Space, because of the sound and the graphics and everything. If you do that in the dark with your headphones in, Dead Space can get to you, for sure.
Daytime, curtains open, volume on low.
I think, and I haven't played PT all the way through. I've watched playthroughs, and I think a huge part of PT is kind of what I was touching on. It's not so much the horror elements that you see as much as those things that you see hint at something terrifying. And it's kind of on the player to fabricate what it is that's so terrifying around you. Like, you will definitely see horrifying things in PT, but they are never like the end game of horror. They are the setup for what you fabricate as the player. And that is why horror works the way it does, is because what terrifies you is very personal. And horror works by presenting you with the opportunity to project your fears into the gaps that the medium provides. So if you know what terrifies you and the game lets you believe that your personal fears are in the game, you will be terrified. But if it explicitly tells you this is what's in the game, you should be scared of that, and it's not what scares you, it's not going to work.
This is Choose Your Own Adventure, offered to masochists by sadists.
That's a great way to put it.
That's vile. But yeah, no, I think you've actually pretty much nailed it. And the don't show us what's there aspect of horror is the classic, isn't it? And like you said, we can see this in other media as well. Film, Alien is terrifying up until you see the alien, because suddenly you realize it can be defeated. Aliens takes a slightly different approach with that. Jaws is much scarier when you can't see the damn shark. As soon as you see the shark, now it's a shark. And all of a sudden,
I think that's
formulate a plan.
The huge element of like Subnautica's horror is, you know, something's out there. The most terrifying part is, you know, it exists. You know you can't see it if it's 30 feet away, just because that's how light works in water.
Yeah.
So there's this ever-present threat, and you don't need to know what it looks like. You don't need to know what it's capable of. You just know that it's always there, and it's potentially very close by.
I can tell you a very stupid one now. This is not graphics, I'm afraid, but it is me being a coward. My first ever platinum trophy that I got on the PlayStation was Assassin's Creed Origins. It's the one set in ancient Egypt. I'm scared of snakes. I'm very, very scared of snakes. There's a lot of snakes in that game. They're fucking everywhere.
There's a very large snake in that game.
That's fine. The comically like oversized like snakes and shit, I'm fine with. Resident Evil, that snake, no problem. Resident Evil, the little snakes in the garden. Like, if a snake is real, I can't handle it. I spent that entire game. I spent like first 8 hours, first opening area, never saw a snake. Don't know why, just didn't. And then at one point I was riding through the desert, and in the distance there was this site of interest, and there were 4 snakes there. And I can remember shooting them from a distance one by one. And it's a camp that had been set up, and overnight the sand had cleared and the sidewinders or the cobras killed whoever was there. And that's when I realized, oh shit, there's snakes in this game. Hopefully that's the only one. A little while later, I'm walking through the brush, and there's just this noise. Like, oh! You know, and I realized there's a snake rearing up. I spent the rest of that game in this low state of anxiety. Snakes. I wore a heart monitor. My resting heart rate's quite low. It's like 55 or so. It's about 70, like playing a game, getting a bit into it. 115 average as I'm just sitting there at the idea that there's these snakes somewhere out there, and not knowing where they were was what killed me. As soon as I could see one in the distance, there was the feeling of, okay, I can deal with that one.
Yeah, and
But the
it's
feeling
exactly
of walking along,
what you said with Jaws is, if I know something about, if I know its location, if I know how it attacks, I can strategize. I can approach this pragmatically. I can build a defense. I can handle this. If there are things that I don't know, I'm going to be scared.
So when you have the graphics with that, you have the flashing thing, you have, I don't know, just like they move real fast across the screen or whatever. But again, you go back to like the old horror. I wouldn't even say that they're horror, but like Castlevania, for instance. I mean, that could be spooky on its own. You could play Zelda originally spooky on its own just because of the music and the atmosphere and stuff. But I wouldn't say that necessarily that their usage of those is the graphics are creating that spookiness. I think they're just using all the elements together, including sound and things, to actually do that. So I don't know. I just don't think that the graphics by themselves necessarily need to go that direction to create that same feeling. But
well, I think part of why I keep going back to horror is to kind of tie into that element that you mentioned earlier of the mind's eye in games. And I think the element of the unknown and relying on your mind's eye are two sides of the same coin. You're giving the player the opportunity to project what they want to see or what makes sense to them in this environment. And when you detail everything in very impressive graphics, that ability to project or create what you think it should look like doesn't really exist. You're provided with all of the information already, and there's not as much area for you to kind of piece things together on your own. And I think that's why in games where, there's a horror element and they're graphically impressive, a lot of the horror is not shown to you. In Resident Evil 3, you still have those jump scare moments. Like the opening sequence of Resident Evil 3, Jill is being chased by Nemesis. And the scariest parts are when Nemesis is not on screen. You'll get that jump scare as he bursts through a wall, and then your immediate reaction is, I need to run. I know what I need to do. I have a plan. When he's not on screen, you're free to panic. You're free to look around and go, all right, I don't even know which direction I need to go. I don't know which direction I need to avoid, more importantly. And I think that's kind of where you need to recognize what you can do with graphics and what you should avoid. If your graphics are incredible, highlight the elements that your players want to see. If your graphics are mediocre, give your players the opportunity to fabricate what you can't capture in graphics.
Yeah, there's a group of games, though. I'm going to pick on BioWare for a minute. There is a group of games that I could say amazing games, classic games, top 10 games for me, easy. However, they do feel dated because of the graphics. KOTOR being the top one of that, and then Dragon Age Origins. We keep asking, especially with the popularity of Dragon Age, why don't they remaster that? Because everybody would play it. Everybody knows that it would, but why don't they? Who knows? Maybe it's just an income thing. But those games, and Dragon Age 2 to a certain extent, because that one did get rushed, and it's just that they had to like put a lot of things there together just to get the story done. And it's an amazing story, Dragon Age 2, so I'm not going to say anything bad about that. But the assets for the original Dragon Age, and which was actually they still hold up. They don't look bad, but everything's just brown. Everything is brown. There's a lot of collision issues. I mean, it could definitely use a remaster. And then KOTOR. Everybody's been begging for a KOTOR remaster forever, But who has this apparently? Well, I guess EA has the rights to some Star Wars stuff. I was playing Jedi Fallen Order recently, and you go to Coruscant and look at how beautiful it is, and it's just aesthetics, and it works. But it really gets you immersed into that game. And imagine if they just pulled that and made that terrace. It could. I mean, it's possible. It's doable. They're there. The assets are owned by EA, by somewhere. But my point here is that there is a group of games out there that definitely are classic games. They're immensely replayable, but they are suffering from their graphics, and they could use a reboot.
I will say there's another genre in gaming where I think graphics play a bigger role than they might in, say, like an RPG or like an action adventure game, and that's combat games. Things like Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter. Mm-hmm. I think that is one of the genres where the gameplay is straightforward. You know what you're trying to do. There's not, a lot of opportunity to go in tremendously different directions. So it feels like the graphics should be a primary focus because the gameplay itself is relatively simple. So you have the luxury of focusing on more complicated elements somewhere else. And particularly in games like Mortal Kombat, they've fully embraced that, and they've implemented systems that let you, I mean, if it appeals to you,
it does.
Really, really dig into the brutality and the gore of the combat game. And I mean, that's Mortal Kombat's whole appeal, is it's absolutely brutal. There are horrific finishing moves that end somebody's life, and you just happily playing, enjoying the interesting way that they've represented this heinous act, and you don't even register it. You're just enjoying the game.
Well, it's oddly enough, it came up yesterday in a conversation I was having with a friend. We weren't even talking about graphics in video games, but at one point I think they were waiting for Mortal Kombat patch to download or something like that, or they were downloading the game, and they were saying that, oh gosh, this game's like how many gigabytes? I think it might have been over 100. It was some enormous number. And they were very explicitly saying, explicitly in both senses of that word, they were saying very explicitly that they don't understand why we need good graphics in this game. There's no point rendering it in such a high quality. It's just a beat 'em up. Let's get it nice and simple. This should be a 5 gigabyte file and that's it, not 100. I don't need to see the veins. I don't need to see the abs. And I was kind of on your street. I want to see those veins because I want my guy to be able to rip into that guy's body and pull the vein out. I want to see these realistic, over-exaggerated, past realistic fatalities, animalities, whatever they're called. I want that in the highest resolution possible. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that kind of game is vastly enhanced by better graphics.
I think the thought is that, yes, we can get the numbers now, of course, but how's that game going to look 10 years from now? Yes, it's going to look dated. It will. But is it so dated 10 years from now that it's unplayable? Because that's like the examples I was saying with those two games. Like Dragon Age Origins is pretty much almost unplayable now because of how much they were trying to push the envelope for back then, and yet still really focused on the gameplay mechanics, which was great. But again, it's one of those, like, you're almost better off throttling down. So that way the long term is better, but
I think now we might, and we've said this so many times over the years that I'm probably wrong, I think we might have passed a point where games today in 20 years will look awful.
Yeah.
They will look dated, but we are at such a point now where I'm not too concerned about how a game's going to hold up. But if you go back to when we were making these quantum leaps in gaming graphics, and I think of two titles, which you've heard us mention before, Final Fantasy 7 and Final Fantasy 8. I think 7 has aged better than 8 has. Graphically, they realized their limitation, built their blocky piece of shit characters who looked like balloon animals, and worked with that. In 8, they went for the more realistic image, and as Banana has rightly pointed out, that's aged awfully. And you take it for it is what it is. It's an endless series of memes, an endless series of jokes. But if you take a second and look, it looks rough. It looks really rough. So yeah, knowing your limitations and where you are, and maybe not trying to push the boundaries, and maybe finding a graphical style that works for you with the hardware that you actually have available to you, maybe slightly away from the limit. Don't use 100% of what's available. Use 80, use 90, and make that look good.
Absolutely nailed it. It's not so much about the trying to maximize what you're capable of with the available technology. It's about picking an art style that works with the available technology. If your art style is hyper realistic, in 20 years, your art style is going to look like if your art style is somewhat cartoony, but you can master that style with the available technology, in 20 years, it's still going to look somewhat cartoony, but nobody's going to be like, this sucks. They're going to be like, this looks the way it's supposed to. And I don't think you see that if you go for the hyper realism. You're going to say, well, this doesn't look like real anymore because we've progressed and I know what I am now capable of viewing in hyper realism.
Yeah, it looks fake real, which is worse. Yeah.
I was going to say, if you take this outside of video game and you go into the art world and you look at Western art, particularly religious art over the years, you don't really see people trying to be that realistic until 1500s, 1600s. You have people like Michelangelo who do it. You have the Bellinis who do it. You've got Titian. You've got a whole series of artists who work on this hyper-realism, and it looks fucking amazing. Prior to that, they didn't. Generally, they worked with what they knew. So Renaissance art generally doesn't look that realistic. If you go and look inside Gothic cathedrals, they weren't doing that. And it's not exactly the same thing. They weren't working with processing power. They were working with hand-eye coordination. They were working
I think there's an element of it that is the same. Like you, in the medium you choose to work, I think technology advanced. You'll see, much older paintings that have very realistic portrayals of people. But if you look at stained glass, that's never meant to look hyper realistic because you're making glass. It's very difficult to get exactly what you want from the medium, and you need to respect the medium that you're working with.
That's perfect. Honestly, you can take another one as well. Not to labor the point, but we're going to. If you can have in a similar way with video games, where for myself, I largely saw it over the years. So gaming from about 1997, 2012, pretty much every year shit looked better. It just got better. You'd have outlier games that looked worse. You'd have outlier games that would attempt to look worse. They would try to look old-fashioned and try and work on an old style. But on the whole, I thought games were constantly trying to get better because there were these big grand leaps to be made. Now I feel like we've largely passed that. And that's where you're getting a lot of this more rebooty style of art, this more retro style of art that people want to bring in. Mm-hmm. Because we don't have those big technological leaps to make. Mm-hmm. We still have leaps to make for sure, but not the same quantum leaps that we have been making. And to do another labored painting analogy, we did hyperrealism, and the Impressionists came after that. They knew what they could do, and they chose not to. Yeah. And that's a lot of the beauty that you get with these games in the modern day that do try and appeal to an older style, is they know what they can do, and they choose not to. And I will say, it should really be my favorite game because it's always at the top of my list when someone says, what's got your favorite music? What's got your favorite graphics? What's got your favorite combat? But it's still not my favorite. I don't think there's a more beautiful game on the PlayStation than Persona 5. Mm. I don't think there's a game that's more beautiful. There are games with better graphics, but I don't think there's one that's more beautiful because they found their style and they made it work in every part of their game. And that great unity that they have, where the menus are as stylish as the main characters, are as stylish as the dialogue boxes, is as stylish as the save files. Outrageous what they do in that game.
Yeah, for all the examples we have of like sometimes, pushing that envelope too far, you do have examples like Alien Isolation.
Wonderful.
As old as it is, it still looks like a modern game. The one you just mentioned, Persona. Even modern day, I could even argue some like gacha games like Genshin or Honkai Star Rail. They're amazing graphical games for what they do, and they're different from each other. And so they may, be gacha games, but graphically they're in their own vein, and it really works. They're really good at telling their story based on what they do.
And you can continue with that with very beautiful models in the game.
That'll probably help. If I'm trying to annoy you, I've got to have something that keeps you coming back.
Exactly.
And that's kind of why I mentioned the 2 that I did, because, and of course there's Wuthering Waves that just came out. I have no experience with that one. I haven't played it at all. But I mentioned those 2 because I know for a Honkai Star Rail, I probably have like 150 hours in it. I haven't paid a single dollar to it. They put in so much content. Yes, it's easier to kind of like streamline through the game if you want to, or get whatever character you want by putting in money, but you can play the story and do all the side stuff and have tons and tons of content. I'm the example of that, and not pay a single dime to it. But then you also have like the other side of the coin of that. And like modern day, you have Stardew, Graveyard Keeper, things like that. Immensely cozy games that are very immersive, but in a very different way, but it does it exceptionally well.
I'd say one of the games I've sunk a lot of hours into recently has that kind of callback to, I want to say like Diablo 2 era graphics. It's a game called V Rising, and it's a kind of survival horror almost. But it has that. It's not isometric because you can rotate the camera, but primarily I play with that kind of 3/4 angle or top-down view that you get from Diablo, and the gameplay works with that view, and the graphics are just good enough for you to operate in that world and know what's going on, and not so great that you can't imagine a little bit more than they put into the game. And I think that's an element of modern gaming that very, very good devs will recognize, is nothing we produce is ever going to match the imagination of our players. So unless we are trying to explicitly define something that is integral to telling our story or creating the experience we need, it's probably better to let the players kind of imagine for themselves what it is that they're looking at or what it is they're interacting with, because they'll come up with something that suits them and fits the game and improves their experience across the board. We don't need to create it and try to figure out what has the most mass appeal. If we let everybody kind of create it for themselves, they'll put in what appeals to them.
Yeah, one game I always go back to, probably the longest annually, is Star Wars The Old Republic. That art style is so different. I mean, it's not cartoony. It's not hyper realistic. It's that, for me, it's that perfect in between. You know, WoW has that same appeal. You know, it's a very unique art style. It works for them. It's functional. I still have my key thing for Star Wars. So I keep it right here on my desk. Talking about things on the desk. This is always right here on the desk. But that graphical art style really encapsulated me into that world of Star Wars, even though it's not like any other Star Wars game out there. It's not like any other Star Wars movie or series or anything, but I think it really works. And it's kind of unfortunate it's kind of fallen off, but the storylines for Star Wars The Old Republic are great. But independent of that, I think the art style really worked for it. I think it had that going for it.
But you found the great example that you mentioned just then is World of Warcraft. I mean, that has a style that you can definitively mark as WoW style. And when you see other people try and do that, it looks like they're trying to clone World of Warcraft and trying to make something like that. I think another game that much more modern, that has defined its own identity in its graphics, is Fortnite. Fortnite looks like Fortnite. I know that when the trailer for Dragon Age Next dropped, I've forgotten the new title. It's not, Dreadwolf, is it?
Veilguard.
Thank you, Veilguard. When that first dropped and we had the character introductions and people were saying it looked...
Dreadwolf.
It's
in my head.
Dreadguard.
I was going to say Dragon Age IV. That's right. That people were saying the trailer looks like a Fortnite trailer. It looks like a Battle Royale trailer. And this is a massive IP all of its own. And we were looking at this trailer, we saw the graphical style and immediately attributed it to this completely irrelevant game that has just made such an impact, such a mark on the world of gaming.
Yeah.
In such a distinctive graphical way.
Yeah.
Nothing looked like that, really. And then they marked it down, and now things try and clone it. I'm not saying Dragon Age tries to do that. I don't think it does.
No, yeah.
But just in that one trailer, it being linked to Fortnite really, for me, encapsulated how much that art
Yeah.
style had become a thing in and of itself.
Yeah, that's a totally different discussion with the whole Dragon Age trailer thing. I was like, yeah, name me the Dragon Age trailer where it looked like the game. Origins, 2,
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah.
3, Inquisition. None of them looked at all like the gameplay. And they've said this is not gameplay. I mean, so I don't know how else to convey that to people. The trailer
feel like
has
that
nothing
is
to do with it. So
kind of
never
an
has.
issue in modern gaming of how do we market our game without showcasing our game? Like modern trailers I don't learn anything from them.
But you see the exact reason why they're damned if they do, damned if they don't, because you have an example where they show historically they've never done that with the Dragon Age series. And yet if they had shown gameplay, it would have been like, well, it doesn't look like the kind of game we expected. I mean, well, they did both a trailer and a gameplay reveal, and neither one of them was like, that's not what we wanted to see. Well, what do you want to see? I don't know.
I think
It's
that
just,
is,
That's the definition of putting something on the internet. As soon as it goes out there,
Exactly.
the outrage factory rolls into place. You could do something perfect. The
I
internet's
think
gonna
Zelda perfectly captures that reaction from the audience when they announced Wind Waker. There was a huge backlash because they had showcased what they were capable of in a previous trailer that looked nothing like Wind Waker. It looked more like Twilight Princess. People got very, very hyped for Wind Waker, expecting what eventually became Twilight Princess. And then when Wind Waker came out, people were like, this is horseshit. How could you lie to us like this? And now, Wind Waker is beloved. Twilight Princess is probably to a lesser degree, but I never hear people bring up Twilight Princess with the same affection as Wind Waker. And Wind Waker has a very unique art style, and it's not reliant on graphical precision or just taking advantage of the technology at the time. It's very much, we chose to build the world in this style. And I think it's held up more. I think I can go back and play Twilight Princess now and appreciate the graphics, but I don't feel the same way about it as I do Wind Waker. And a lot of the gameplay elements are the same. It's very much an art style choice.
But I can think of a lot of things where this happens. We're almost never happy when something new comes out. If it's got the same banner as something we've had before, if you change something, we don't like it until you convince us we like it. I remember Final Fantasy X, people complained about that when it was first coming out, and now it's one of the most beloved in the series. I will still say it's my go-to introduction game to Final Fantasy. If you don't know the series, start there. It's a nice, safe middle ground between the old and the new. I remember Fallout 3, when that came out, people complaining about it being pulled away from the old style of Fallout 1 and 2. Not that anyone wanted fucking Fallout 1 and 2 remade. I mean, that's aged like hell. But we're complaining that it doesn't look and feel like that. When Fallout 4 came out, we complained about how clean it all looked. That VATS is now slightly moving instead of not moving. But now, Fallout 3 is apparently the classic. Okay, no, sorry, New Vegas is the classic, and we agreed on that at the time. But we also look very favorably on 4, and we complain about Fallout 76. This is a never-ending circle. I think the older you get, the more you realize, as we all know, the more you realize that this happens with every single new thing that comes out. And sometimes we're right. But a lot of the time, we're just jerking our knees until it comes out and we get to play it for ourselves. And then when the next one comes out, we'll use that as our new frame of reference for what comes next.
So you're saying that when Starfield 2 comes out, we'll love Starfield?
I believe his words were, sometimes we're right.
Yeah. I was also thinking, is he going to pick me up on Fallout 76 as well?
I think Final Fantasy 15 was another perfect example of that, because looking back now, seeing the way Final Fantasy 15 was advertised, it was perfectly accurate. It was a Final Fantasy game made for Final Fantasy fans and people who had never even heard of the series. And that is exactly what 15 does. It's the middle ground that everybody should be able to appreciate. And when it was first released, people lost their minds. And it's just like, you just want to hate something.
So,
and there's plenty of stuff to hate. Go hate that.
But
Give this a chance first.
I am concerned that on our podcast, we're a bit too kind about everything and a bit too a bit too soft. We're gonna have to generate rage sometime soon. Get those clicks.
Give it like 30 seconds.
Final Fantasy X-2.
So bad.
There you go. Just winding up the Jack in the Box. Sorry, Legion. Go ahead.
I love to hate on Elden Ring to get a rile from people because they love Elden Ring and the Souls games so much that they're like, it's almost on the borderline of cultish or zealotry, right? So I love to like pick at that. That's just who I am, right? But if I'm being honest, I mean, as far as like the gameplay, guess what they use for their trailers? Pure gameplay. Why? Because they can. Yeah. Because there's no reason not to, right? The game is a gorgeous game. And there's so many different environments that you can contrast the light with the dark and then make it dynamic. And so it just really works for what they do. I can't think of very many games at all that can or will do that. They're bold enough to do it because they know what they're doing. They're capable of doing it because it's already in game. Those assets are there. They're not making it up. They're not lying to you. And they're basically saying, you guys know what to do.
You know what you're getting with Souls games. Like after you've played Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2 is not tremendously different. Dark Souls 3 is not tremendously different. Bloodborne, Sekiro, Elden Ring, they're not overhauling the system every time. They're Souls games. Everybody refers to them as Souls games. And you know what you're getting. So when you see an advertisement for the new one, it doesn't really have to do much beyond tell you it's a new Souls game. You're gonna buy it. Yeah, that's pretty much how it works every time. Whereas with other games where you change direction, you try and implement something tremendously new that's a huge risk. You struggle with how to market that because you're taking a risk. Do you want to advertise your risky decisions, or do you want to link it to the things that have been successful in the past, even if that's not the style of game you're building anymore? And I think it's just Dark Souls sits in a unique position.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying is that because we're so, to me, Elden Ring is still brand new. I mean, it's only a year and a half old. So you have
older than that, boy.
Yeah, but it's like right there in that new position, and you have so many people that are, and in fact, the DLC, I believe, outsold Witcher 3, I think. Yeah. So
it's impressive for DLC.
Yeah. So
but for a fucking hard game that you might not even be able to access the DLC if you haven't beaten two very hard bosses.
Right. So my point is that, coming back to the graphic stuff, I can I'm not a BioWare advocate or anything, but I can totally understand a little bit now that I've been thinking about it, all these reactions to Veilguard. You got me saying it now. But you can't. But Veilguard
mission
now
accomplished.
being kind of like reviled the way it was. I'm like, yeah, because we have this a shift that you are taking that risk. We're not going to show you a trailer based on gameplay. We are going to change direction in art style. We are going to, so it's not the typical audience that's out there right now that's buying games. So I don't know. It's one of those that I think it's going to be really important just to kind of judge games and critique games based on what they are produced, not what they may be.
Yeah. I think we're highlighting an element of the gaming community, and I don't want to shame anybody, but this is something that I find particularly frustrating among the gaming community, is you will see developers like they did with Veilguard take a risk, and you will see this knee-jerk vitriolic reaction from the gaming community. And this is how we get game developers to stagnate and just give us the same rehashed crap we've already seen before.
Yeah.
If you punish them for taking a risk before you even see what the payoff is, you're deterring anyone from ever taking a risk.
Well,
and we don't get anything new.
And I think this is something always worth considering with, first of all, with risk-taking in media, that's how you get iconic movies. That's how you get iconic TV. Think of The Shining. That's a weird movie. Think of 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's a weird movie. There's a how many minutes long Swan Lake section in space?
Mm-hmm.
That's a risk taker. And they did it, and it worked. Gaming, I want my producers out there doing something new. It's where, as we mentioned before, with Square Enix, them, I will always respect that Final Fantasy, they always take a risk. There's always something new. A, they make a new world, but B, they change their combat systems. Who does that?
Yeah.
That's bizarre. The remake, they've attempted to do something entirely different, for good or for ill. They've tried to do something. Good on you guys. I think it's just worth considering, though, that when we mentioned the video gaming community, thankfully, we're not it.
Yeah.
Twitch is not the video gaming community. YouTube is not the video gaming community. We are not the video gaming community. Thankfully, it's enormous. And the vast majority of people who play video games will never engage with what we're making, with what the highest, most viewed, like Elden Ring content creators on YouTube are making. They will never watch that. They'll never go on Twitch. They're just going to go live their life, come home, turn the game on, probably never watch the trailer, and play it for half an hour, and then move on with their life, and then play the next day for 2 hours or whatever it is. Most gamers aren't a member of the gaming community.
In fact, I think I haven't looked at my numbers recently, but I think the highest grossing games are still mobile games.
I was going to say, it's got to be Candy Crush or something like
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as much as we think that this is the game of the year or whatever, at the end of the day, I mean, if you're going to go by pure sales and stuff, they don't even come close to the mobile games.
Let's do it that way from now on. Pure sales. I want to see this.
There's a Twitch streamer that I occasionally get the chance to watch. The channel, I believe, is called Pirate Software, and it's a streamer who worked for Blizzard as a cybersecurity expert and is now kind of an independent developer of his own game. And he touches on a lot of these. Yes. Believe his name is Thor.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah.
He's very, very insightful as far as the gaming industry goes. I think he went to like an expo or something, and they advertised the game that they're working on, they're developing, to a lot of kids, and they put a monitor, a mouse, and keyboard in front of them, and the overwhelming majority of kids reached out and touched the monitor because their experience with gaming is on a touch screen. So for gamers like us who grew up with a console or a PC and we know mouse and keyboard or controller, they know touchscreen controls. And that is a completely different direction. And there's, like with any other technology, there are things that lend themselves to touchscreens. There are things that lend themselves to controller. There are things that lend themselves to mouse and keyboard. And I think if you want to branch across all of those, you're going to challenge the hell out of yourself to come up with something that works on all of them.
Well, I'm thinking of games that I love that I think you could retranslate them over to the next generation with touchscreen gaming. Strategy games, think of things like XCOM. That could work incredibly well with touchscreen. It probably exists. Now that I think about it, it's been a while. It probably exists on the iPad or something.
Not to continuously bring up Final Fantasy, but Tactics, my favorite game, was ported to mobile. It works so well on mobile because it's a tactical game. Turn-based games on mobile work because they're turn-based.
But is that where we begin to show our age? I'm thinking of, for example, I'm still to this day never happy typing on my telephone. I call it telephone. On my
yes, we're showing our age.
On my rotary dial. I'm never happy typing letters on my telephone keyboard because I had a BlackBerry for quite a few years, which had the tactile keyboard. And I miss that. And I like having that tactile response. So I'm happier using the sticks on a controller than I am simulated sticks on a screen, on a telephone, for example. Got to stop saying telephone. It sounds weird. Can't stop. And I do wonder, actually, if you might see a generational...
You're not saying cellular telephone.
Because I landline in a minute. If we might find that there's this happy medium in between generations where the youth, whether they will be familiar with sort of touchscreens and controllers, and we, the aged and decrepit, if we will be familiar with controllers and the mouse and keyboard, and if the controller will sort of be our halfway that works for all of us over time, but we had better fucking get used to the touchscreens because they're probably here to stay if that generation is using them as widely as they clearly are.
Mm-hmm.
I still think that the one genre of gaming that we brought up before, like Monkey Island, which is the point and click, is still one of the most diverse genres, even though they all kind of do the same thing. So like you take a great game like Disco Elysium, It's just a point and click game. I mean, at the end of the day, but it is so much more than that too. But you can take Monkey Island, which is, find the clue, find the object, and, move the story along. It's still an RPG, but it is a little bit more than just a point and click as well. So I think that particular genre of games can take a little bit more risk when it comes to graphics, because you're still doing the same thing, just in your own art style.
Well, Monkey Island, oddly enough, is a beautiful example, because when they made the remaster, didn't they make the old graphic style available? And you can switch between the old and the new, depending upon your taste, at any moment?
Yes, I believe, at least in the few that I've played recently, there's just a button to switch between graphics, and you can do it mid-conversation.
Wonderful. I love that. I know they have this as well for, oddly enough, Dragon Quest XI, which, despite being its big 3D open world, can be converted into a top-down classic RPG style.
I believe the Halo Master Chief Collection did the same thing. And
I think you're right.
In that regard, I've always been like, why would anyone want to play with the old graphics? Yeah. I just feel like with that game in particular, there's no reason to go back.
I can
beyond
give
nostalgia.
You one reason for Halo 3 for me in that collection didn't work on new graphics. Why did you spend all this time making these great graphics, but you've neglected something somewhere that fundamentally allows this damn game to work?
Yeah.
Which does then slightly soil the experience of playing on the old graphics as well.
Yeah, those were excellent examples. The newest Tomb Raider remaster, 1, 2, and 3, same thing. I go back to it and I was like, oh, this is exactly what I remember. And then I would flip over to the old graphic. I'm like, oh.
Oh, it's not.
No, I don't want to do that.
That is probably the best way to showcase what the mind's eye is capable of. When you go back to a game that you played at a young age with these graphical limitations, and you're playing it with modern graphics, and you're like, this is wonderful. And then you make that harsh transition to the old graphics, and you're like, oh, this wasn't wonderful before, but I loved it.
I played the Mass Effect Legendary Edition. Now, Mass Effect's not that old. And I thought when I was playing it, this doesn't look any different. This is what it used to look like. Oh yeah, I guess that's a bit higher resolution. And then you go back. And you realize that even in that much smaller gap, what's Mass Effect 3, 2012? Legendary Edition 2021, maybe? So we're not talking 30 years, we're talking 10 years-ish. It is noticeable from the newest game, in that series until the remaster, in an age when we don't think we make gigantic graphical leaps. In hindsight, the improvement they made, was absolutely outstanding. Mm-hmm. In certain places, there were times when it didn't seem necessary, but when they did it well, it looked great.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder how many games we've played like that have gotten a remaster, and we play the remaster and we're like, did it really need a remaster? Because we can't remember exactly what the old one looked like.
Yeah, the Diablo 2 remaster is like that too. You can toggle between it, and it's amazing the difference.
You do have that combination of the mind's eye and the rose-tinted glasses. You build this perfect image up of what it was, and you also were probably playing on a much smaller TV at the time. I think that's a healthy perspective, to know you're being nostalgic about it and not actually thinking that it was the best and that, we're never going to improve upon that. That's a healthy kind of nostalgia. It's not I want to go back to that. I appreciate it for what it was, but I'm also very curious to see where gaming is going to go.
I think there's a point to be made there where we have nostalgia for the games we grew up with, but for long-running series where those games have continued into the modern era, it might seem like we want the old games again, but there's an element of it where we want the experience of something new. We don't want the old games. We want the new games to be new. So when games try to capture that old experience that you got, they're going in the wrong direction. They're trying to capitalize on nostalgia when the nostalgic feeling was, this is new and exciting. That's the feeling you should be trying to capture.
Well, and it probably transports you back to a time in your life as well. So you just have that. I remember when I was playing this, I was also doing X. I remember that I would play Mass Effect 3 after coming home from football on a Saturday. I know I would play Mass Effect 3 before going out to the club on Saturday night. So like in that little window there. So you put yourself in that situation that you're remembering everything around the game as well. Mm-hmm. And that's why I want to see games trying new things. And that is why on that specific example, I've been such a proselytizer for the remake and for Rebirth, is I want to see what you can do. I want you to do what Banana said more than once. I want to see you taking risks and trying something different.
Well, my last point on this is when I was little, we had the Atari. And where Atari went wrong is that they kind of opened up their license to anybody. And so really you get all these games like Space Invaders, Pac-Man, horrible ports. But we played them because that's all we had. But they were horrible ports. In hindsight, the graphics were so bad, it ruined Atari. It actually ruined Atari. And NES, the difference that they did is that they were very proprietary with what they licensed to. And so their quality level was always a consistent minimum. And so was the difference in why they took over, really. So I could argue that graphics were the main thing back then.
I don't know if it's that their quality was consistent, because there are plenty of terrible games for those older Nintendo systems. It's just that when the quality wasn't there, Nintendo made their money. They licensed the cartridge to the developers. They got paid by the developers, and then the game sales went to the developers. Nintendo covered their costs already, whereas Atari was impacted by the failures of the games to be marketed. Nintendo protected themselves from that, and they might have done so in a somewhat unethical manner, but that's why the business persists and Atari doesn't.
Yeah, but like I said, I could also argue, like I said, that those graphics from that time period, I lived it. You would buy a package of, like I said, Space Invaders, Pac-Man, whatever, and it was nothing like the arcade. It was nothing like the box. It was nothing like any accompanying media that was there. It's a bad game. But a lot of it were just that turned us off was the graphics.
I think you've highlighted on an element that maybe modern gamers don't recognize. When box art and game art didn't match, it was horribly upsetting.
Yes.
And now box art's not really a thing.
Yeah.
So you don't get the opportunity to make that comparison.
God, that's an odd thought, isn't it? The amount of times that I thought, what a shame it is that we don't have manuals anymore. I know it's a very old man shouts at cloud thing, but Final Fantasy VII, let's go. Sorry. But having that game manual, reading it on the bus on the way home, that was a wonderful thing. Actually, just having the box as well was quite nice.
Yeah.
And that I haven't really thought about, honestly. And that inability to have the box art and that title screen, then trying to see what it was on the inside and whether it matched up.
I also
I'm just drifting into the past.
I'm also remembering the element of the Sierra games. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Space Quest and King's Quest, but boy. I think King's Quest 6, one of them, had a like copyright protection built into the game, disguised as a game element, but you needed to look at the manual in order to decipher a code in the game.
Mm-hmm.
So you had to have purchased the game and retained the manual.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a thing that you can do anymore because the internet exists.
Yeah.
Now people have gone to other methods to protect their games, and they're usually more invasive and problematic.
Yeah. I still have a game. It's actually in Steam. It's called Battle Bugs. And to unlock the game, you had to go to a certain page, and it gave 4 characters, and you had to input those characters. And I'm like, well, how do I do this? Well, I looked in the game files, and there's a PDF of it, and so I'm able to open the PDF and play it there. But that's how they
That's exactly. I have the King's Quest Definitive Collection or whatever it's called, and it's the exact same way. You get access to all of the King's Quest games and their manuals specifically for that reason.
I love that. But if you re-release Metal Gear Solid now, you will need to enclose with it some kind of document saying that when Snake says, or when Snake is told that the radio code to call insert character's name, because I've forgotten it, the radio code to call them is on the box. You're going to need to know that meant it was on the back of the fucking jewel case. That it was there, and you had to go and pick up your box off the shelf, check what the code was, and then type it in.
Mm-hmm.
Which, oddly enough, if you'd rented that game from Blockbuster, Not great. Yeah, you don't get the case and you do that.
All right. Well, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap that up. But any other final thoughts or?
Yeah, do you think we have to apologize for not really talking about graphics?
No, I think we did. I think we covered graphics pretty good. Yeah.
We jumped back and forth, I think, but we
hinted at games that have graphics.
Graphics?
Yeah. I think all these
so I think
games
we
have
have it.
graphics. Yeah.
Perfect. Well done.
Every
everyone.
game we discussed has graphics.
Yeah.
So I think we stayed on topic.
I'm thinking, did we talk about any command line games? Hey, those all text adventures.
But that's surprisingly how Diablo got its direct influence, is that they took that same method and said, how do we put this in a environment where you can, do what you're actually writing and typing and reading. But yeah.
What just came into my head is I've just realized that the reason I know Sierra Interactive is Leisure Suit Larry.
Yeah. There's a lot of Sierra games. Caesar was my favorite from Sierra.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm going to go with that then. Caesar.
Wait a minute. Wait.
You edit
Heroes? Was Heroes of Might and Magic Sierra? Or was that, who was that?
I don't think that was
Because they were a publisher, weren't they?
Yeah.
They developed and published.
Because me and Com are big Might and Magic 3 fans.
Because they were big Leisure Suit Larry fans.
Yeah, we're both we love Larry. Justice for Larry.
Podcast number 4, Leisure Suit Larry.
Yeah. All right.
Music, graphics, lore, Leisure Suit Larry. It's just the natural progression.
All roads lead to Larry. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm done.
All right. Well, I appreciate everybody being here, and we will check you guys again later. And hopefully stay tuned, subscribe, and like. Thank you very much.
Thank you.